my first acquisition at Magellan was an A340. It had a tail strike. But we looked into it, realised that the APU, the four engines, and the landing gear were not on the aircraft at the time of the. So
maybe that's why it had a tail strike.
Yeah.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. Welcome back. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. With me once again, he won't go away, Garrick Deschavon of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who is it this time?
I'm still here.
He's still...
Yep. Well, on this lovely Friday, we are chatting with David Rushe, or Dave Rushe, for those of you that know him a little bit better. So he's currently President and CEO at Magellan Aviation Group. Prior to that, he was EVP at Magellan. But before that, he was at Ergo Capital as SVP of Trading and also SVP of Mature Aircraft and Engines. He had a little stint at Cayenne Aviation as CTO. He had some time at VAS Aero Services as asset manager. He also worked for IBA Group as a senior analyst. He is one of, fellow ISTAT certified appraiser, or he's an ISTAT certified appraiser, not fellow. That's the title in itself, but anyway. And he has received his BSc in Management and Marketing from the Dublin Institute of Technology, and he's also a licensed aircraft engineer. So he's got a really well-rounded background for what he's doing today, which is fantastic. So David, or Dave, this is your time on wing. So before we get on with our guest, which you guys are going to absolutely love, we obviously, first of all, we want to thank all our listeners for listening to us and making the show what it is today. And we certainly welcome any of you to, whenever you see us at conferences, just please say hello. And we'd love to hear that you guys are listening and fans of the show. As you all know, we do run businesses. And so from my end at Collateral Verifications, on the appraisal side, right, obviously if you have any needs when it comes to aircraft, engine, landing gear, you name it, right? Just please feel free to reach out. I'm very approachable. I'm happy to chat about any kind of projects, and we'd love to work with you on a variety of things. We do have some publications out there as well. I do Turbine Aircraft Guide, Turboprop Value Guide. I've got the Aircraft Rating Tool. So there's various publications that we put together that can kind of help you on your day-to-day. Great reference points. So definitely, kind of reach out to us, and we'd love to chat and kind of start that relationship with you.
Okay. Back to the show.
Well, Dave, thank you for joining us on the pod. It's always great to see you. We certainly love chatting with you, so it's nice to actually have you on the podcast, and we can record you, so that way we have some evidence of what you say, which is fantastic. We can use that.
We call that blackmail.
Blackmail, yeah.
Okay, well, sounds good. Yeah. I just run that by the compliance department. But yeah, I'm fine.
That's right. Yeah, but no. So, look, as we start with all of our guests, we love to kind of hear background, how you got into aviation, where the passion came from, all that kind of stuff, because most people have kind of some kind of story as to how they got into aviation. Yeah. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah. So my story is very much old Irish, of the old country. Where my dad is from is a place in the west of Ireland, County Mayo, and there's an airport there. I don't know if either of you have had the privilege to fly in there or see a teardown there. It's called Knock Airport. It's basically in the middle of nowhere, and but it was initiated by a bishop who wanted to bring people. There's a shrine locally, so they've got this airport plonked in the middle of the west of Ireland. My granddad used to take me there to see the planes, which there was only 2 or 3 of them a day, so they would have had BAC 111s, and which Ryanair would have had before they went into the 737 Classics, and Shorts 360s that Aer Lingus used to operate to Dublin. So that's kind of where it all started, really. And when I went to select my university course, I didn't get enough points to get into do aircraft engineering in Limerick. The University of Limerick, which has a great course and still does, and indeed we have people in Magellan who've come through that course, and so I didn't get enough points, so I ended up doing a management and marketing degree, which I didn't really like, but I stuck with it and did the 4 years, and in the Dublin Institute of Technology, which is now called TU Dublin. So moved to London 2 years later with my wife, or she's my girlfriend at the time. we'd never lived together before. So here we are in London, and then we planned on staying a year. The global financial crisis happened, a couple of things, but I had a conversation with Tony Whitty. They were looking for somebody at the time. So I met with him and his since deceased Malcolm Holt about a job, and they had a company called Cabot Aviation at the time.
Yeah.
I think I was a bit green around the ears for them, so he recommended I have a chat with Owen Geach at IBA.
Yeah.
IBA hired me in a commercial department, and I was, I was very, I had no experience, no hands-on experience, and but I kind of meandered my way through the company and ended up working under Stuart Hatcher, and we had a lot of
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
yeah, I know, yeah. And but we had a lot of projects at the time, and I always felt I was exposed in that I didn't have the technical knowledge. So one of the
Listen,
guys
if you were working with Stu Hatcher, you've been exposed to a lot more than you may
it
realize.
wasn't working with, it was working for.
Oh, it's even worse.
Oh, yeah,
his,
that's right.
his erratic working hours, and but I remember we landed some big projects at the time, and it was some really cool work. And I remember spent a lot of time out in Turkey working on maintenance benchmarking contracts with some airlines out there. But I always felt I don't know if it was imposter syndrome, which is something that's carried through, but I always felt like I needed to get to technical knowledge. So one of the technical guys in IBA recommended I do the EASA Part 66 course. So at this stage, Aoife had moved back to Dublin. I was living in London, and I had time in the evenings to myself. So I was studying and then working during the day. And so, I did as much of that as I could. I didn't need the license. I just wanted the knowledge. So IBA was, as it has been for a lot of people, but it was a real solid foundation for the rest of my career. And like Kane Ray and Mike Yeomans would have joined kind of and worked under, working with me in Lease at the time. And it was, we had a really good team, and a lot of people have came through or stayed there. So, but an opportunity came with VAS, I remember, in 2012. And I basically to be doing more work on the acquisition side. So I took it on. It was a big change to leave IBA and, to move into the parts side. But, inadvertently led to where I am now, as all the decisions kind of have. But an opportunity, I was a year into the role with VAS, and I'm not, which kind of changed because they kind of went from a company that were buying assets for teardown to a company that was doing a lot of consignment and a lot of surplus work. So I lost my USP a bit, but a company came along, an aircraft engineering consultancy, an airport engineering consultancy came along, and there was a role there, and I thought, like, this is my dream role, Took the position. It was based in London, and it became clear that they didn't have enough work for me, or they were focused on different contracts and stuff like that. So we got married October 2013, and booked the honeymoon, and then I got made redundant a few days before Christmas. The honeymoon was booked, and I was like, oh Jesus, what are we going to do? And Aoife was back in London at this stage, of course, and we were like, what happens now? So one of the first phone calls I made was to a guy called John Costello, who died a few years ago, who would have been a big mentor of mine. And he said, I know Magellan might be looking for somebody. Put me in touch with Niall Duggan, who's the managing director of our EMEA office, and another mentor to me. And here we are. And I remember we were on honeymoon. We were sitting in Hong Kong, and I got a text from Niall to say, could I come to Shannon the following Thursday? And I knew I had a job with Magellan, and so things transpired. So I had a really interesting 7 or 8 years with Magellan. Got involved in a lot of stuff, and I was quite close to Marabeni, the shareholder, and based in their London office, and loads of different projects and acquisitions, business development in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Some funky experiences with corrupt cops in Nairobi and everything, and but like a really, really great time. And then COVID happened, and no one had a kind of a view of how we get out of this. I couldn't travel. We there was no asset. There was assets available. We had no funding, so I was like, confidence was gone. And then Cayenne came along. They were looking for a CTO role, which wasn't really a CTO, but it was looking for somebody with technical input into pricing. I'd moved back to Dublin at this point, and they wanted an originator, and that was a really, really fun year I had there, and a lot of exposure, and a lot of I'd never, with Magellan, we were one captive shareholder. We never had to lever any deals. Got all that exposure with Anuj and the guys at Cayenne, and helped build some really good foundations there. And and then things went to Ergo, and so kind of bounced around a bit after COVID, and there was some changes in Ergo, which kind of I was originally hired in on the engine and kind of end of life role, which was ideal. Working with Carl and Rebecca, and Ergo acquired Tariff, and there was some changes in the company, and then and then conversation at ISTAT in London in October 2023, where Magellan indicated they'd like to talk to me about maybe coming back into a leadership position. And I always had a plan to go back to Magellan, but it was about a few years earlier than I thought. But I was like, this is what I want.
Prodigal son returns. David Rushe.
Returns,
You've got Steve Jobs, right? I mean, same caliber, same level.
Like Michael Jordan here in Charlotte or something.
Yeah, there you go.
So a bit like Trump, I came back for a second go at it,
are you saying, is this what we should look forward to?
We both got airplanes in our office, right?
There you go. Yeah,
that's true.
That's
yeah,
right.
But I paid for this myself, and it's made out of Lego. So, that's kind of and then kind of came back in the Magellan in a kind of a business development and origination role. And I think the way the market was going, there was nothing available for teardown, or certainly nothing that you could build a strategy around, so we decided to go into leasing. Magellan had always been a leasing company, but we decided to be a bit more strategic about it. It's like, okay, let's build some pipeline for the future, and we had a lease pool there, which would have predominantly been regional engines in the past, so Pratt and Whitney Canada 100 series and CF34s. So
good stuff.
Which the good stuff,
yeah.
Which that's a very hot market at the moment, actually. But so now it's 5B, 7B, V2500, and some PW4000. So we decided to we secured a couple of engines in 2024 with leases attached to build a pipeline for the future, and that remains part of the strategy today, and will continue to be. So, if you don't want, there's a bit more part out availability in the market now, and some of that, or we've got a pretty healthy part out pipeline. Some of that is because of a bit of availability, but some of it's because of increased coverage and having, some additions we've made to the team as well. So, but it's been, some aspects of it have been bumpy since I came back. The market's been a little bit unpredictable. Acquisitions have been tight, and we've lost some people. We've got, the natural order of things. We've got some guys on the leadership team who are, kind of reaching a retirement age and stuff like that. So, all that's to be kind of dealt with. So, kind of an unprecedented level of transition, but we have the advantage of a very supportive shareholder, Amara Benny, who, they've obviously diversified their subsidiaries recently as well, and a bit of collaboration amongst them as well. So it's been good. Yeah, we've got the relationship between us and Marabeni is obviously paramount, and it's been really strong. So
yeah, it's been going on, because I'm trying to think, when did Airbnb by Magellan, right? Because they bought a stake initially, right? And then they
Yeah,
ended up buying
it
the whole
was,
thing.
yeah, 2012.
Yeah.
And at IBA, we actually wrote the white paper, the
Oh, wow.
aviation
Okay.
market white paper
Yeah.
for Marubeni's investment in Team and subsequently Magellan.
So did
But
you write yourself in there to be like, by the
yeah,
way, at some point, this you should really, put this guy at the top. He's great.
yeah. Let him come
Put
in
your
for
name.
7 or 8 years and then get rid of him and then get him back.
That's right, yeah. Let him go out. Let him
all
get some
part of the plan.
experience. Bring him back. Right.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
part of the whole plan.
Yeah, but I know if it just every time I look at it here, it kind of bounced around a bit. But I don't regret any of the decisions I've made because they've all led to this pathway, and hopefully everything goes well because it really is the role that is ideal. I think it's ideal for me and it's the one that I've wanted. And yeah, it's hard work for sure.
Well, like I said at the beginning, right? I feel like you've got a pretty well balanced career because of the fact that you've kind of worked in different aspects of aviation, which all kind of work out in the end, right? I mean, they all work well together, so it's kind of nice to have
it's
that.
A lot of touch points. Like we're a part of business. We have 2 massive warehouses and 130 odd mouths to feed, and so we're a parts business at the end of the day. But we lease. We're getting programs going with airlines now. We buy from the banks, the lessors. We're trying to increase our direct airline trading. So you do get a lot of as many touch points as you would with a kind of a traditional, conventional lessor. We're just not dealing with new aircraft. That's the only difference, with speaking of which, we have an appetite for new tech this year, but I just don't see a lot of value in what's trading at the moment. And maybe we'll get into that later. But there is opportunities out there for sure.
Yeah. But it's at a premium, right? That's because everybody kind of feels like if we're going to do it, let's go in. Yeah, let's go in first.
And even with the A380s, the first 10 aircraft will do well out of all those teardowns, and then after that, it diminishes.
How has so you're running the show as opposed to just the whole? I say run the show, but you get the idea. The idea of being a part of a team as opposed to leading the team. Because I mean, nobody asked me, but if somebody were to ask me, how would I characterize Dave Rushe? I'd say pretty laid back guy. I mean, he's really easy to work with, not like high pressure in your face. You're easy to hang out with. How has that transition been to kind of, be in the place where the buck stops?
Yeah. So, it's a good question. And I like to hang out with you too, Courtney. So it's cool.
Did you hear that, Garrick? He didn't say you.
Notice he didn't say my name. That's nice.
No. He said me.
I gotta go. I'm you know what? I forgot. I got something else I gotta do.
But I think the challenge has been because I've worked in the company a long time, so I've got friends here, and in this conversation, you have to have conversations. You have to try and drive people and get away from that, he's, it's cool. He's laid back, and it is. And then there's I'm the big challenge for me, and it was something my predecessor had warned me about, was having to step away from the deals and trust other people, because we're all deal guys, right? And that's what we all love, and relationships and everything. And it's about how to define when to step out and step back in. So we've got a really, really good CFO, a really good CCO and legal team, and then heads of operations in both offices who've been with the company a long time. And that's great because you can kind of trust them to have those conversations. But sometimes you're trying to find a balance between being a buddy and then being the guy who's kind of have to push this along because we're getting questions from the shareholders and all this. So that's a challenge. So it's something I'm working through at the moment, to be honest, Courtney. And it's something that was I was kind of aware of going into it, and especially when most of our deal discussions take place on the European side of the business, because that's where, the leasing community still provides the bulk of our origination opportunities. And that's all in Dublin. And I'm kind of between Charlotte and Dublin and balancing all that. So yeah, sometimes things occur and I'm like, oh shit, why didn't I know about this? And but that's okay sometimes. So yeah.
Well, you can't be everywhere all the time, right?
No, and
that's a thing, right?
And to that point, like my wife and daughter are in Dublin and I'm here and I'm back and forth. So it's it's a lot. A lot of time in 27-year-old American Airlines 777s.
Young.
Yeah.
And
which goes back to your guys and the crusade, should I call it? You guys were.
Do you think we were part of the Crusades? Is that
what? The white body shortage? You guys were. I might have.
I thought you were just calling me old. I am, but as Pointy points out, Courtney points out all the time, I'm definitely older than he is. But
and the best part is he always will be. That's why I hang out with him.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, which sucks. But anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, it's these old wide bodies, right? It's that market is still going strong. Every time I talk to somebody, it's still it's still kind of hanging in there. And I think those next time we'll talk to you, be like, oh yeah, I'm still flying those 35-year-old 777s at American, right?
Right. I think that's a very likely outcome.
Yeah, and the cabin crew will have aged in
just as well. That's right. Yeah, they stay with the airplane for life.
Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly. Yeah.
You get assigned an airplane, and that's it.
Yeah. But that has been a challenge, Courtney. Just to go back to your question there.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the Pratt 4000, which American does not have any 4000s. I don't think on their triples. I think they're all
Trent.
I think they're all Trent. Yeah. But this is just to jump into it, this is a niche market that is so constrained. And visible too, right? We saw United with the issues during COVID. I think they had the uncontained in Denver, the ability to get overhauls. I'm interested more just from kind of an education standpoint. How do you look at like a situation like that on the Pratt 4000 market from the perspective of the part out world, the parts, the kind of latter half of life? Is that an opportunity? Do you see that more as a risk? How do you think about those type of things?
Yeah, so we had a lot of legacy investments in. So we're predominantly like all of our 94-inch stuff is gone. So we're everything or most of what we're dealing with now, or the vast majority of which is 112-inch material.
Yep.
So
which is only on the triple, right?
Yeah, obviously there's and I don't know how many aircraft. I meant to look it up, but I don't know how many aircraft are flying. But it's probably less than 200, significantly less than 200. Yeah,
I think like Japan or Korea and United, and that was kind of it.
Yeah, and then a couple of Omni maybe or whatever.
Sure.
And so we got a lot of legacy PW 4000 112-inch exposure. We bought engines, we consigned engines, we had a program with Pratt, and like a few years ago, had you told me how much activity we were seeing in the engine, I would have laughed. And but again, it's all two shops, So you're very vulnerable to someone making a decision. But Pratt are putting a lot of time and effort into speed, the turnaround times and the scrap risk on putting this material into shop is incredibly high. And it's something that they're working on. And Garrick, I don't know if you were there in Hartford a few years ago, they told us that they were still, Pratt were saying we're still doing dollar for dollar on shop visits, that there was no discounting on material. But now you're seeing new LLP sets having to go in, because engines were reaching the 15, 20,000 cycle limits. So it's really, but if people are spending that money, they're going to want to see utility, right? They want to see an earnout. So to Courtney's points, we could be looking at 7 or 8 years of 112-inch operations. And somebody told me at conference recently from an airline that they were told it was 60 112-inch shop visits above either level 2 or level 3 this year.
Wow.
It's like in the old days when the fleet was full utilization and all that, you'd expect to be shopping 25% of the fleet anyway, or more.
Yeah.
But this is, and the spare percentage is, but if someone told me, you can go, if you've got $4 million, you can go and buy a teardown 112-inch engine or a Select one, probably go with and we love the Select one, it's a great engine, but you'd be going 112-inch, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, because if you look at the operators for the 112-inch, right? The as long as they're not making any moves to replace them, there's always going to be a need, right? Because like you say, and especially if they're still shopping the engines, which that's you would think at this point they'd be like, going to burn off whatever we can, and then fine, move on, right?
Yeah.
But no, they're still putting money into them, which that's now, crazy.
On the 94-inch, you'll get some supply trickle into the market. Like I don't know. I haven't the MD-11s I see when I fly around the US. I see plenty of them parked up. But I don't know. I thought there was talk of some reactivations.
They're coming back.
Reactivations.
FedEx,
Yeah, some of those spares will maybe feed into the market. But the 100-inch is another story, right? Absolutely dead during COVID. We were people offering to consign us engines similar to with the CF6-80E. Again, the market's gone bananas for those engines.
Yeah.
But the 100-inch, that's the only of the three dimensions we've never gotten into. But we're looking at some options there now. There's some lease opportunities out in the market. But again, that engine is going to be what the 112 is now in 6 or 7 years, with a wider operator base and a few more shops.
Yeah, right. Because there's only what? I forget how many engines or how many aircraft are out there, but it's
like 60.
It's only A330s, right? It's not a big fleet, right? But you're right; those airplanes are not going anywhere. Yeah,
and GE didn't really come to the table on the freight conversion, so you've got Rolls, which is dominant, and Pratt, two established P2F engine offerings,
and that'll keep that going for a long time. Wow.
I mean, on the 4000, on the 112, it's United. They've got 38 active. Then ANA has 11. It's the U.S., Korea, and Japan. So ANA, Asiana, United has a couple in maintenance and storage, and then Korean and Jin Air has one. Then you get some Ukraine International.
Okay.
There you go. I mean, it's in storage, so it's somewhere else, but yeah. But it's in the 60 range, I think.
Yeah. So it's high risk, because of the repair cost. If there's creep, it has a big influence on your sale price, and then the lead times and the scrap risk. If you can manage all that, it's do pretty well. But it's not going to be around forever either. But that legacy product, it helps us out when times are lean in terms of active teardowns.
Yeah. So I'd love to touch on something that you talked about before, where when you came back to Magellan, right, and you guys were predominantly part out, right, and then you looked at it and went, look, things are definitely slowing down because of the environment that we're in. It's getting tougher to find things to part out. Let's look at kind of broadening the strategy to look into leasing, and the more we talk to people, in that space, the more, you realize that, you definitely need to have that diversity to be able to continue to do well. You can't necessarily just rely on kind of the secondary market to be able to get stuff to then part out. You kind of have to have your own feedstock to be able to do stuff with. And, and I think you're also seeing some people getting on whether it's the repair side or MRO, right, to be able to have that kind of cradle to grave types situation. Otherwise, you're always just relying on others for material, right? Yeah. So how do you guys look at that? How do you think about that, kind of moving forward in terms of how do you guys evolve from what you've been doing?
Well, we talked a bit about, I mentioned earlier about, building the pipeline for the future, but there will be an inflection point in terms of new tech, and we looked at, we always would like to maybe differentiate ourselves. So we looked at some of the, there was some part out or stubby life opportunities on the Gen X kind of last year. It dried up a little bit. There was some lease opportunities out there, which are actually probably pricing lower than the G90 actually. But yeah, so we're trying to identify that inflection point and when we kind of run at it, But our customer base, their base has never been as broad as it is now. We've invested a lot and hired some really good people out in Singapore to cover APAC, and see that as a big growth area. Latin America as well. There's lots of opportunities down there. It's just about, the getting comfortable with the credits, and they roll in and out of bankruptcy and all this, and but it's really, moving away from that kind of EU, US centric market in terms of our coverage. But and if we buy an asset on lease as well, we're a sales organization at the end of the day. If there's an opportunity to flip it and it's a seller's market, then it's something we will look at. And we've always had to weigh up the dynamic between tearing down or having a green time engine that we bought that we want to place, or that's planned for the lease pool, and then somebody comes in with a rock star offer and you're like, okay, it's hard to turn this down. So it kind of have to hustle. If there's a strategy in there somewhere, I don't know, but yeah, that's that's what we're having to do, and I hope we never lose that agility either, right? Where we're locked into only one avenue of meeting our return expectations with an asset, because you have to be able to adjust with the market. And I think, we've a lot of V2500 opportunities on the go at the moment, and you're kind of wondering, okay, that's the market everybody's a little bit scared about, because of Spirit. I would be more optimistic about it, and it's not just because we have a pipeline, but maybe there is a point when you go, all right, guys, let's hold off here. Let's allow this material to work itself through and see how the market goes. We've as I said earlier, we've lost people and we've hired people, and we've seen the challenges of trying to get everybody to bed in. But it's great to see the different approaches that people bring, be they from an airline background, be they from a competitor background, an MRO background, and what they bring, and what, if we're, looking at M&A opportunities in the future, if we, look at adding MRO capabilities, to have that experience there really helps as well. And it's had its challenges, but it's kind of a lot of what we're about at the moment. A very broad answer, I know.
Yeah, which, I mean, look, it's a broad industry, so
yeah.
I don't mind the broad answer. Yeah.
But
so
I have noticed, just on like definitely a tightness in terms of trading opportunities in the last 6 months. You get the normal post Dublin conference rush of RFPs, and we did see that. But it wasn't like it was in previous years. And I know that's a consequence of just the fleet being, the CO and the NG fleet being a year older and coming closer, and the lessors have greater visibility on the lease terminations, and they're like, okay, we'll take these to maturity or however, or maybe the extension discussions have dried up slightly. But yeah, there's certainly been from our perspective, a dry up on that kind of 2 to 3 year lease attached activity. So we need to
How much of that
well.
do you think was just from the market being so hot the last couple of years that we kind of reset our expectations and it's returned to normal, versus Iran, versus just a greater market cycle?
Well, I think some of it is down to yield, right? Because you've got lessors out there who are, gone into Neo and Max SLB opportunities at very skinny lease rate factors.
Mhm.
And I think they're getting some yield from the older assets. Maybe they just want to hold on to them as well, you know. We talk to some lessors and they're like, we kind of say to them, can we come in and take this aircraft off you or do a forward purchase and handle the redelivery process? And they're like, no, we want to manage that ourselves. And you're kind of going, okay, they need the full life cycle of revenue, or maybe it's something they just want to do and they have the technical team and the expertise or whatever, or they want a bit more freedom in terms of how they want to remarket the asset. But there's definitely, we saw post-COVID, we saw a lot of airlines doing these selling owned assets into the market and leasing them back, whether it's for cash generation or just to, get them off the balance sheet and take advantage of their ability to obtain discounted leases versus, a trade-off versus the cost of ownership. And there's some airlines, like some of the US carriers who didn't get involved in that at all because they had healthy cash positions and they didn't see the motivation to do it. But those opportunities have kind of dried up as well. So I think the airlines maybe are getting a bit more comfortable in terms of their capacity needs. But we may see those opportunities re-emerge in, regions which maybe are a little bit more challenged. Like there's a lot of talk about APAC and, Korea, Southeast Asia maybe having, with fuel supply issues and some voluntary, unpaid leave and stuff like that going on with, and we've got some exposure down there. We've got the program with the 737-800s on lease to EaStar so we're giving that some focus. But we do, I think there will be opportunities, the sale and leaseback opportunities from those airlines, which will put some opportunities back into the market.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because if you think about talking about how lessors are less incentivized to maybe get rid of some of the older stuff, which makes perfect sense, right? Because if you think about most of the leases that have been put in place, even if it's over the course of the last 10 years or shorter, these were all good. I mean, the lease rates were good, right? They were all, when you're looking at like 2015, 16, 17, 18, right? All those were pretty good lease rates. And then even during COVID, where I don't think necessarily people restructured a lot of deals, I think it was more just rent deferral, where we're now beyond that and we're back to the previous rents, right? So a lot of the deals I think that lessors have are good deals, right? And so, so for them, it's like, do we really want to get rid of our cash cows at this point? We know we can get a good, good amount for it, but it's still, we need that. Yeah. So it's interesting that cycle that we're in right now.
Yeah. And obviously at the end of COVID or in COVID, the airlines had the power with regards to, if they want to do their extensions, the lessors are only too happy. But now that's, depending on how you are in terms of capacity, that power may have shifted, Yep. But definitely some signs of, catch up with the OEMs. So we'll kind of wait and see how that marries up with, any demand impact with what's going on in the Middle East.
Yeah. And I think that, as you say, that's coming, right? Because I mean, the OEMs will continue to ramp up production as they are allowed to do so, and as they can cope with that with supply chain and everything else, right? That's not going to stop. They're not going to be like, well, things are slowing down, so let's not build more airplanes. Yeah. They've been constrained for too long. They will continue to ramp up, and so at some point we will have that. The point where we go into an unbalanced market, just because of that. But
we are, looking at potentially, if there's some groundings, and then there's a solution, and then suddenly there's this mini COVID revival and a ramp up in demand, and are we going to see like a bit of a bonanza in terms of spare parts demand? Because suddenly you've got all these aircraft that need to be reactivated that have been stored temporarily. And are we going to look at a kind of a mini 2022, 2023 in the market?
That's interesting. Yeah.
I kind of like that thesis, right? Because like if you think about it from the perspective of an operator, let's say right now you're looking at fuel prices and you're like, I need to wait and see. I certainly don't want to kick out airplanes because that's what got me in trouble during COVID. But you're with high fuel prices, you will probably give more priority to the new kit just because fuel burn is lower. And you'll probably wait on those shop visits, but you won't send that airplane back or you won't kick it out. The question that you're asking is, okay, assuming that plays out, what happens when things go back to normal? Suddenly you've got these airplanes with shop visit or just need airplanes that need to be reactivated.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, unplaced airplanes at lessors, but even at the operators. I think there could absolutely be a rush on pun intended on that type of spare parts. It's a little bit different than like demand and shortage or whatever, but the requirement for spare parts, you could definitely see, okay, let's put this airplane through. We need the parts to do it.
Yeah.
That would all happen at the same, that decision would all happen at the same time.
Yeah. And I also wonder, because I feel like more people remember how quickly things can turn around.
Yes.
I mean, and when we're in, when we're in it, I guess it's maybe different, right? It depends on how steep of a downturn we see, right? If it's a global event or if it's regional or not, right? But I also feel like having gone through, COVID and everything else, I feel like people are like, well, yeah, you know what? Things are gonna be bad for a little bit, but they'll turn around pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So then let's hold on to these, and airlines may think the same way. Yeah, we're not going to get rid of these airplanes, right? We're going to hold on to those, and so that where you could see that all of a sudden that rush of demand coming in to account for that. But yeah, because I guess it depends on the extent of the downturn that we will see at some point. Yeah. But if it's not as bad as people think, I think you kind of the turnaround will be that much faster.
Yeah.
Because people will be like, oh yeah, this is not as bad as COVID.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, all right, well, let's go back to traveling. Like,
right. But with one,
I don't have to wear a mask.
There's one major difference. I mean, aside from just the magnitude, and that is so the longer that this goes on, this kind of wait and see, which I'm still just waiting until fall. Because they'll be considering capacity decisions for next peak season for summer 27 at that point. But Boeing and Airbus are delivering airplanes at increasing rates during this time. That's different than what we saw during COVID. So there's a bit of a race there. We're burning the candle on both ends where, okay, we don't want to commit to getting rid of this older aircraft, but we still have the new ones coming. I mean, if ever anybody's interested in watching an airframe OEM do its best Joe Pesci impression in Goodfellas, pay me. Yeah. Just wait till airlines start saying, well, I don't want that airplane right now. They're like, that's cute.
Yeah.
Pay me.
Yeah.
Right. So those airplanes are coming.
Yeah.
And we didn't see that during COVID. So there are two big, I mean, aside from the obvious differences with COVID, but there are two major differences today. One is we actually saw and remember COVID. The idea that there could be a shortage, the idea that we could see demand come back faster than we can supply it. Just memories of that. The market approaches it differently. But second, we're seeing increasing production through the challenges as opposed to, well, no production on the MAX and then decreasing. So it's not a slam dunk.
Yeah. No. But I do think that again, it depends on how steep the downturn is that we go into, right? If it's another COVID type situation when you've got, 95 or 96% of traffic that, goes away, right? That's different. And if it's global, but if it's not, if it's more regional, I think that has a less of an impact. But I completely agree in terms of because right now I think both OEMs are willing to defer to help customers defer some positions because they know that they can find homes for those. that's not an issue.
They're still overbooked, right? They've still sold more than they can deliver based on the
right,
timing.
but that doesn't last forever, right? And that's
no,
the thing.
it definitely does not. And we've seen deferrals, right? We've seen, I think, Volaris, the Frontier get out front with some deferrals. There were, I think, JetBlue did even early on, but that's because Airbus was like, okay, like that actually helps me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
At some point, it won't. And I guarantee you, Airbus won't be like, you know what? Yeah, we'll just nudge down production rates. You just tell us when you're ready to pay for your. No way. Again, Joe Pesci. Like, pay me.
But like from a parts perspective, the obvious difference with this crisis is that they're, we fly domestically in the US. We'll all be going to Chicago next week or whatever. Planes will be rammed. Airports will be, the Charlotte will be the usual shit show that it is during when it's getting into high season. And there is a safe haven that we can go to. There is markets fully functioning where we can sell parts. We didn't have that during COVID. We had it nowhere. So that is an obvious difference. And the same in Europe, I think we're not that concerned at the moment, actually, about, we'll for sure wait and see. And I agree with you, Courtney, that we got over the summer and we'll know a lot more.
Just time.
Yeah.
That's 3 months from now. So that's twice as long as the current crisis has lasted.
Yeah.
So we'll know.
I saw like a utilization chart there this morning or yesterday about, what, like a lot of what hasn't been discussed much about, the impact on utilization of the Middle Eastern carriers with all this going on, which is fairly obvious, but there's 1 month of upward trend that we can kind of hang our hats on, and we've got a 320 out there, which has been grounded, which we're redelivering soon. But that's having a kind of a mini example where I guess other lessors have it in a magnitude,
Yeah, and one of the biggest stories right now that I think just doesn't get the attention it deserves is that airlines aren't cutting. They're just not. Like, we keep hearing about how this is a crisis and they just can't make it. Airlines are not cutting capacity to the level that everybody assumes that they are. Yes, and the Middle East couldn't fly. Like, some of the largest wide-body connectors in the world, they're still down, 50, probably about 25% today. But, that's a lot, right? Yeah. So if you take that out and the industry is still up, we are not seeing the cuts. We're seeing airlines talk about cutting, but they're not actually doing it. And it's for this very same dynamic. Nobody wants to miss out on the recovery. It's probably the same reason the oil markets are as soft as they are, and probably why they'll stay at this point for longer than people expect, is simply because everybody's not afraid, but the downside, if you were trading oil, the downside of a tweet coming out over the weekend and crashing the market, the supply and demand of oil didn't change, but that creates real downside. So it in a weird way, craziness creates this. It's like everybody's just afraid to make a decision because you don't know which way. The same thing applies on the aircraft side. I just think there's just a whole lot of wait and see. Mm-hmm. And the question then is, what happens when they see? And to be clear, that's not a bearish sentiment. It could be just as bullish, right? It truly is just wait and see.
Yeah, that's true. So, there's a lot of discussion now about the longevity of airplanes like COs and Gs, right? Especially, when, and we can get into that discussion as well later in terms of like the part outs on the Neos and the Maxes, which are happening right? So there's all this talk about like, oh yes, you know what, NGs and COs are going to be around forever. That's never going to end. Like, how do you guys, being, in a as a company that provides support to these platforms, right? How do you guys analyze that to kind of figure out, okay, how long do we need to have sufficient parts to be able to support the market? And when do we need to start thinking about other things on a more regular basis? Because I'm sure now Neo's Max is probably like, it's opportunistic, right? If you had the opportunity to do it and you thought it made sense, you would look at it. But it's not like, hey, we need to be doing this all the time. So I guess my question is, yeah. So from the standpoint, like, durability on COs and NGs, like, how do you plan for that? Like, what's your time frame to go? We need to make sure that we've got what we need for X amount of years.
Yeah. So we're trying to de-risk our asset strategy in as much as possible into focusing on later build A320s and NGs, and well, less so on the NGs because there's just none available, but later build A320s, and where you've got that Neo crossover, and you're right up to the landing gear, and so and the same on, I think I've talked a lot in panels recently about the divergence in the market between early build V2500s and then select, and so we're trying to focus all our teardown activity on selects, or and the same tech insertion evolution PIP on the CFM. So but we get excellent data from the shops and our customers in terms of their shop visit forecasts, and the vast majority of LLP requirements are still 8 to 12,000 cycles on the CFM, and then something similar on the V6 to 8 or whatever, because the cycles are longer. But when that changes, we'll know. All right, and as long as people are putting that valuing that utility in engines, then that is a real bellwether for us in terms of what the market's going to do. We get a lot of we get the kind of traditional consultancy reporting in terms of what the outlook is for shop visit demand forecasts and all that, but like we had a situation pre-COVID where most of the smart money was shop visit peak in 2022, 2023. That moved to the right in COVID, with COVID, of course. And the shop visits took on a different profile, and that you had more module swaps, you had more reduced builds, you had sorry, somebody just dropped in my lunch.
Yeah.
Did I hide that?
I didn't get mine.
So yeah. So you had the whether those shop visit forecasts that the pre-COVID were for performance restorations and overhauls. Now it's module swaps, reduced builds, etc. But we still have confidence in longevity. But it's hard to do it on the edges because you don't have crossover. But with the airframe part out, you can do it by just focusing on the later build, current production aircraft, without that value exposure that you have, your value risk that you have with the new tech. But we are, our first Leap and Gen X, less so GTF, maybe, I don't know. Our first acquisitions will be with Lease attached, so we get time to learn the product and figure it out. Like we're kind of, our investment criteria is 3 years maximum lease term, and we'll go beyond that for specific regions if there's potential engine exchanges throughout the lease or something. So, but it's we're limited to 3 years. So those Leap opportunities are few and far between, but there is some of them out there, and then we would look at an extension on a Leap because it's strategic and all that. But playing around with a naked engine at the moment, I'm trying to put it through hospital visits or whatever, like on a Leap or a GTF. It's just not where we want to play, because we don't know enough about the aftermarket to, that's how we source material. So, but but that's our rationale. We're also, trying to diversify our product offering. So, looking at different opportunities, getting to, maybe get into the MRO space. And so that will help to kind of reduce our exposure just to the parts side of things.
Mm.
But we will always be a US-owned company. And that will, if you look at our history, we were amongst the first to tear down ATRs, first to tear down CRJs, E170s, tech insertion 7Bs, V2500 selects. We have torn down some Evolution engines. And that was a real eye-opener because I never thought we would pay above 5 million for a teardown engine, which had no LLP life and no HPT blade value. Yeah, a little bit of modular value, but that teardown of the Evolution last year has been a very successful performer.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that, on from that Evolution point, people buying Evolution specific material gives me comfort about longevity in the market. And indeed the engine OEMs have been very good at introducing those upgrades throughout the life of their engines, which, pushes out those mass retirement rates. Like, what's the gap between the baseline and tech insertion was like 15 years, and then you had the Evolution came out 5 years later. So all of that will be replicated into the future.
No, absolutely. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, and I do think that obviously we've talked about it, and kind of we understand the commonality between the platforms, right? And you kind of reminded me of that when you were talking about, we focus on some of the younger builds, A320s and NGs, because there is that commonality with the Maxes and Neos. So that ultimately there is that kind of transition by having, the younger stuff, that'll play out into the Neos and Maxes as well without having to buy a Neo or a Max at this point. Yeah. Right. And I think I don't know how many people realize that in terms of the level of commonality that the airframes have at the end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then which is potentially a safer investment, a 2016 build 320 for teardown or a Neo, 2016 build Neo.
Yeah.
Sorry, a CO or a Neo,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what's your opinion on, max availability for teardowns? I know there was some discussions this week about it. There's a few out there, of course.
Yeah. I mean, we've had some discussions where, we've heard there's definitely, probably more than a handful that are available for teardown. I think Airfin is one of the first, right, that took some of the younger ones that were, I think we've heard less than year olds for the airframe to part out, and so but it's I think you'll probably see more of that, and that's purely for me. It's purely based on the numbers, right? I mean, I think if you can make the math work where you're making more money by taking the engines off, potentially either leasing those or selling those. And at this point, if you're one of the first few on the airframe side, you're getting top dollar for the airframe. Yeah. Now that will change, as you will know, right? In terms of like when you start getting to now, all of a sudden, it's not just a handful of airplanes that have been parted out. It's more like a dozen airplanes have been parted out, right? Those numbers go down really quickly in terms of what you're able to get out of the airframe, right?
Yeah.
But I think for now, that's what makes sense. And people are looking at it going, well, do I part this out and make a nice return on the asset, or do I try to place it with a secondary carrier that is not willing to pay me for the fact that it's a 1 to 6 year old airplane? They're willing to pay me for a 10 to 12-year-old airplane, right? And so they're not going to pay me the premium that I want. So why would I do that if I can make more money doing, based on just leasing 2 engines or selling the engines and then getting rid of the airframe, right? So it makes sense that that's happening right now.
Even the transition costs and the downtime and everything, just having to deal with like sidewall panels and seats and
I mean, if you there's a weird gap in that kind of 1 to 6 year, probably up to 8 year age, where who actually acquires those aircraft? Like if you go to a secondary airline, who tends to deal in secondary leases are like, yeah, we're interested in a 12-year-old airplane. We'll take a 6-year-old airplane at 12-year-old rates. But it puts it in this weird category, right? Where, especially if you're first, I mean, we saw it on the 321neo. If the engines are worth what they are, and we know that makes the deal right there, and you can be the first on the gear, on, what, just that probably, again, makes it on its own. There's an incentive to just part it out, where there wouldn't be that incentive maybe as much on a 12-year-old airplane. There actually is a higher incentive to part out 5-year-old, one, because the airplane just happened to be that age. But it's this upside down situation is kind of interesting.
Yeah. It's and both are readily available at the moment. CO and Neo.
Yeah.
So it's
Which that's a crazy part, and I think, look, that to me, that trend will change, right? Because at some point you will have more availability on, or actually less demand for spare engines, right? As the OEMs are able to kind of put the engines that have been on the ground that put those back in the air, right?
Yeah.
As they put some of the improvements in the engines, right? That will go down, where all of a sudden the need for spare engines will go down. And at the same time, you also have the OEMs, which will, which have ramped up their spares pool to, 20+% of of their fleet, right? They're going to need to bring that down as well. So does that bring on additional spares that kind of that normalizes the market initially, and then depending on where we are, right, then it could kind of put a little damper on that market as well. So that does change, because then all of a sudden the economics don't look as attractive to just take the engines off and lease them for a couple of years, right? Because then also I think airlines will probably look at it and go, well, sure, we'll take your engine, but either we take it, if you want a longer term, it's got to be a really low lease rate. If you want a higher lease rate, we'll just take it for a year, right? Yeah. And then does that really, I think that's the other part that people forget, is that, spare engine leasing is not a long-term leasing business, right? It's usually in shorter terms that are probably on average anywhere from 1 to 3 years. There's some longer ones, of course, but and that's a lot of work.
Yeah, if there's a downturn, you get this great commitment from an airline to take a spare engine. If there's a downturn or reduction, that spare engine is the first.
Yeah.
The first to be panned, right? And but it's just from a parts perspective, like looking at the Neo and the CO, if you have on a Neo a set of nacelles that might scrap out because of corrosion, because of storage, which happened a lot with the previous generation of aircraft post-COVID, you could be from a teardown perspective, you could be upside down in your investment. The APU demand, it's a 9A APU, it's the same APU it goes on the CO. And if you've got that commonality of parts that's readily available in the market, later build seals, you've got nowhere to go to recover your investment. Yeah, and you're relying on that.
Yeah.
I'm curious how the OEMs are handling spares production of parts, because it seems to me that over the past couple of years, and I don't know this, but it seems to me that they would prioritize the production of aircraft as opposed to the production of spare parts. So if the long pole in the tent were the parts, then you would say, I just need everything to go in the airplane so that I'm delivering aircraft. And I wonder if that creates kind of this long-term kind of macro, not shortage isn't the right word, but just deficit of spare parts that it's going to be tough to feel, because it's just going to be this new average. But that may just elevate the need for spare parts over the next 5 years, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree, and I hope. But I think we another factor in that is that we've got these kind of flight hour contracts, which are being exited now because of the natural order of time, and airlines kind of having expectations that they'd have fleet replenishment complete by now or whatever, or be further along. But so we're moved to a more time and material based process for maintenance, a more traditional process. So it means the OEMs don't have those FHA contracts anymore, so they don't have the visibility on the parts demand. So they've lost that. So it makes, to your point, Courtney, makes it planning for spare availability and for throughput a little bit more difficult. Now we sell a lot of our parts, either as removed, serviceable, or overhauled to the OEM. So into their repair cycle or for their customers. So some of them still do have those support agreements. But yeah, it's definitely an issue, I would say. And we've seen it with some of the less kind of centric to our business items, like I talked about sidewall panels earlier, and because they're so like a IDG will go on an engine, it'll go on another engine, whereas the more specific items, sidewall panels, seats, the lead times are massive. And that's why one of the reasons we'll sit in an aircraft sometimes which has another aircraft's livery or branding on the inside, because there's just nothing available out there.
Yeah.
And for years we had seats filling up the warehouse in Shannon from lessors or from consignment from lessors and from Teardowns. We couldn't get rid of them. Now there's demand for everything.
And when you say seats, I guess you're referring to the very liquid kind of economy.
Yeah,
narrow body seats.
They are now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Like ship kind of 189Y kind of configurations or whatever. Or we'd eject ship sets from lessors and from our own Teardowns as well. Couldn't move them. So yeah, we scrapped a lot of them, and because the space is inefficient.
Yeah. Which that's I think even Boeing made those comments this week about how that's one of the biggest hurdles that they have right now with their 787 delivering them, right? Is basically getting the seats on the airplane certified, right? And that's why they can't do that.
Are these business class?
I don't know which seats.
Or all of them.
I'm assuming, because I also think that on the wide body, right, airlines are getting to be, a bit more creative with the LOPAs. And so that I think is probably creating challenges to,
speaking of creative LOPAs,
things.
Did you see, was it Air New Zealand come out with the bunk beds?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds like a fun reconfiguration.
Especially if you're sleeping below somebody that you don't know.
Well, that just sounds terrible. That sounds terrible. Like, you don't know when you book your ticket. Yeah, if the guy is, although I guess you wouldn't know if they're going to snore anyway, but it feels different when you're on literally 12 inches above them as opposed to, the next cubicle.
They've always had these innovative things, don't they? They do like dating flights and stuff like that a few years ago, and cabin crew coming out in body paint and everything. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
But that's interesting on the seats. I mean, from that perspective, I mean, just Pratt and the whole Airbus saga and getting them GTFs and Airbus kind of throwing a fit as a result. I mean, I get it, but my conspiracy theory there, and I don't know anything, but if I'm Pratt and I'm paying out this compensation for engines that are on the ground, and I go to the airlines, I say, okay, you choose. What do you want? I can give you a spare, or I can send this to the factory and you get a new airplane. Which would you rather have first? And I think right now the airlines would say, I need the engine. Because think about it. If you're an airline, so wait a minute, you're going to tell me I can fly the airplanes I have and I don't have to pay for a delivery that, right? I'll take the lift today without the expense of the delivery and the airplane that's on the ground. Like, it makes a ton of sense from an airline perspective.
Yeah.
And that all just plays into the whole supply chain, the part side of the supply chain, even though it's engine, so it's a pretty big part. Yeah. But that's why they have two engines, right? Just in case.
Yeah.
Just in case, yeah. That's right. Yeah. No more four engines though. Like the what you were talking about before, the BAC 111s or the 111s or Yeah.
No, those only had two, I think.
Two, yeah.
Two? Oh, just two? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So which?
No,
wait,
you're
which
thinking
ones?
the VC10, which looked like a.
No, I'm thinking about the Avros too, right? The Avros had
four.
four.
The Avros, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
those had. Those had four kind of recirculating fans that didn't recirculate. They just,
Yeah.
light homing, I think. even.
Yeah,
Those
that's
engines
right.
were, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, I'm trying to think. We've covered quite a bit.
Yeah.
There was one thing I was
Yeah.
chatting to one of the guys here yesterday, and you know, just on the topic of like, you know, what's the biggest change you've seen in the industry in the
Yeah.
last, you know, certainly my career, and which isn't as long as others have been on this, and longer than others, but you know, so we had a kind of the kind of the obvious answer is we had a confluence of unfortunate events. We had the Max, the crashes and the groundings, and then we had COVID, and then we had Russia, Ukraine. You know, absolute, you know, just a sequence of just chaos, right? And an industry that adapted really, really well to everything. But so that like that reshaped the parts business for sure. And but documentation is the more boring but more relevant answer, I think.
Mm.
And the increased requirements that we're under now to for documentation. It's just it felt for a while like every significant deal that we get involved with, there was a new layer of requirements from our customers, right? And so, you know, the lessors would blame the part out guys for driving all of this, you know, and this lack of now I know there's been some efforts over the years with you know, the AWG and all that, but
Yeah.
without this like standardized list of parts, you know, and we battles with lessors when they're selling us engines and airframe. But no, this paperwork request that you've sent in is you know, this is above what's commercially required. And yeah, so I was talking to one of the we've an engine sales guy here, George, who's been around the block for many cycles, and he was saying, yeah, he compares the paperwork requirements when he was back working on JT9s and JT7s, where you just had a removal tag and that was it, you're away, you know.
Yeah.
Has parked this out, but now, you know, it looked like, you know, with the rollout of the incident accident clearance statement, that kind of, you know, maybe solidified, you know, the old NIS kind of debacle, and then but then the AOG Technics issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now we're getting requests from some of our customers who are buying parts that they want non-AOG maintenance statements attached to the engine, which is, or an engine or a part or an LLP or whatever, which is impossible to do because
Explain that to me with the non-AOG.
so that there was no AOG Technic parts associated with this part, or no no certification associated with that whole mess associated with this engine. So this engine did not, this part did not fly on an engine that had AOG Technics potentially misrepresented.
Right.
So,
Which
I'm
how
sorry. AOG is the company
Yeah.
name, not an air.
right AOG
not-
Technics.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
but the guys
Yeah.
that had the were falsifying parts.
Which, I mean, I don't know how you could serve it or prove it and certify that, because the whole point was they were making stuff up. So
We have to make.
I certify that
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't make anything up.
Yeah. Well,
Which I mean, that's the challenge. Which
Yeah.
from that standpoint, like, does that? I mean, does that add additional hurdles to get into the part out space because of that? Does it? So
I think
which in
it's
some ways benefits
something-
you a little bit.
Like you can source it out. You can sort some of it out with talent. You know, with getting good people in.
Yeah.
We also, you know, we have your tech records team. They need to be, you know, obviously we get audited. We need to be, you know, need to adhere to their regulatory requirements, our customers' requirements, and do kind of stand our ground at the time when we're doing a deal and say, okay, this is what's sensible here. But it is a barrier to entry, I would say, and maybe there's an underappreciation for the skill set that some people who specialize in tech records or specialize in selling parts about and having that experience of what their customer needs. That is certainly a barrier to entry into our market. And it's just changed so much over the years, even in the 12 years I've been involved in Magellan. Just with all those, it's just it was non-exceedance statements, fuel statements, that were that just DER, non-PMA DER, that fluctuates in terms of its level of importance, because if the parts market is undersupplied, people will be a bit more flexible in terms of their acceptance of certain documentation. Once it stays within regulatory requirements, and then you can be flexible about the commercial requirements. But it's something that has changed and become more intense, like dramatically, over even my time.
Yeah. What's DER? I'm sorry.
Designated engineering repair, so non-OEM repair.
Got it.
Yeah. So it's always mentioned in the same breath as PMA.
Yeah.
But yeah,
which to me that's a little harsh, right? I mean, because the DERs are so common, right? It's not like it's something that only certain people do or are okay with, or that's crazy. Yeah,
and there's arguments, like we've seen OEM appraiser presentations, Garrick, and that the OEMs taking varying views towards DER. Some will embrace it, some are like, no, the new OEM component and repair process is always better. But there's a value consideration there as well. So if we don't, if we're not going to get a statement with an engine that we're buying, and there's not enough safe haven parts there where it doesn't apply, then you're kind of, it's a value decision then, and what our customers will accept and what they won't accept, and that fluctuates in terms of demand as well. So
I'd be curious to know the whole tariff debacle last year, right? Year ago, which is now sort of gone away. Right?
It's like 3 crises ago,
right?
Garrett.
Exactly, right? But it was still a big thing for a period of 3 months or whatever it was.
Like, so MRO Americas last year in Atlanta, it was the word on everybody's lips. And then we were all sitting there talking about it. We were talking about it with an MRO, remember, and everybody had their own. We were sitting talking to these guys, and everybody had their own solution, their own version of events. That this is how we solve it, and this is I don't think this applies. And then we all got these texts to say Trump has postponed the tariff, and we were like, okay, whatever. Yeah. Let's move on to the next one.
Let's move on. Yeah.
So it's still so they introduced this 0-0 tariff environment between the US and the EU, which applies to rollable components, which is the bulk of our business, obviously.
Yeah.
But not expendables, which we have an expendables business in Florida, because consumable and expendable parts can be moved between aircraft, ships, whatever. As far as I know, they're not deemed to be tariff compliant, and the tariffs are still an issue for our guys in APAC, right, where they're dealing with countries who don't have bilateral agreements with the US, so there's still exposure over there.
Yeah.
So we took a wait and see approach to it, much like we've talked about with the Middle East, because we and we couldn't justify it in the end in that approach, because we were like, okay, let's not overreact, right? Try and if the customer wants the part, then they have to take on the burden of the tariff. We're not gonna handle it here. But I remember there was an instance whereby we put a part into a repair shop in Europe, and the MRO, instead of sending it to our warehouse in Shannon, they sent it to a warehouse in the US, and there was a 20% tariff on, it was $100,000 part or something.
Yeah.
New, but worth not that on the aftermarket, and so hiccups like that happened.
Yeah.
So that was the confusion.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, like, who, including like yourselves, like who prepared for even though they've gone away, like should we always be aware that things could come back because that's how irrational the world is. And so do we prepare ourselves by relocating certain things in certain places so that at least we know that we don't have to import certain things when we might need them, and if it comes back, like, it's like, I don't even know what the thinking would be behind there, but that's got to be like, you just don't know, right? Tomorrow it could be like, oh, by the way, new tariff. And you're like, crap, now what? Right? I mean, yeah, right.
Yeah. The easiest thing is just avoid the
Fix
US,
the Middle East,
right?
and then we'll take on your tariff. Okay.
Yeah.
Fix the Middle East. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so the other guy who has an airplane in his office, as he gets to the end of his term, he may decide to carpet bomb a lot of his policies, and so we may be back having tariff discussions again. Who knows? It's just very unpredictable. But I think we're geared up for it. That we've diversifying the customer base, like I talked about earlier on, has really helped in that respect. Yeah, not just being beholden to the two big regions, which aren't necessarily getting on the best at the moment. But I'd forgotten all about the tariffs. Crazy, isn't it?
I know, right?
It is,
because we've had so many other things happen in that 1 year time frame. Yeah, because it was a big deal. Because remember we were in ISTAT Asia, Tokyo, and that was still a big point of interest from people. Who were like, oh, what do you think is going to happen? And then it was a big like, oh no, never mind. Just
a lot of that did just go away, right? Like with the stroke of a pen. A lot of it went away, especially for aviation. But yeah, I mean, it certainly was painful. We saw, and I think Embraer is still dealing with that. So airlines are still looking at taking deliveries in the U.S., which a lot of those 175s, or I think all of them, are headed to the U.S., and that creates a problem. And then you get into the issue of, well, wait a minute, exactly how much of this airplane is subject to what tariffs, right? It's a Brazilian made, but it's got American engines on it. So how do you split that out? And then it just came down to what did that local customs agent, how good of a night's sleep did he get? What did he have for breakfast? What kind of mood was he in? And it was just kind of all over the place. But then you kind of created this. I mean, there was kind of this competitive edge in how airlines were able to resolve it, but then not communicate that to other airlines because it was an advantage for them. So those type of things are still happening. It's just worse.
You just hope that the guys that went through that process and have the experience then end up going somewhere else when it happens again. Because you're like, oh, that guy, that was what did he do again? What was that loophole that he had that really worked for us? I don't know. He's gone. Got to go through the whole process again because that was definitely tedious, right?
But it was damaging to the industry, and it's not. I think you could definitely make the argument that we're still feeling the impacts of that. I mean, we talked originally when we just started talking about the softness in the market that started before Iran, right? On some of these asset types, and not that it's softness, but so much as it's just not as hardness. Is that what's the opposite of softness when we were talking about hotness? Is that
hotness? Not
that
strong. Strong, maybe strong is
sure.
Hardness just doesn't sound right.
It doesn't.
I feel dirty saying it.
The buoyancy.
Buoyancy. There. Yeah.
Right, but that's what happens too. Like if you think about just human psychology, that we expect, and it's happening right now with oil and everything that's going on, we expect the impacts to be immediate. And really, that's just the market reaction to the future reactions. And it runs over the course of probably 9 to 24 months before you really kind of know what actually played out over that time. So, I mean, we're still kind of seeing the impact of that for sure.
And like I think we've been a Japanese-owned company. We spent a lot of time on compliance and all that, and so we had to make sure that what we were doing during there was a lot of diligence on the tariff side of things, and it was kind of lined up with there's a lot of export requirements on where a part goes, particularly in the aftermath of Russia, and we get end user statements where possible, which is always commercially tricky, and so with that, the tariffs just became another. But we had some of the processes in place already, which was very helpful. So, we'd have a kind of a firmish commitment from the entity buying a part from us about where they were going to ship the part. We had that in place already, so it did cut out some of the confusion about tariffs. But it was tricky, and it coincided with the start of our financial year as well, or in FY25, and it was the MRO and everything, it was just a bit of craziness,
Yeah.
So,
Oh, well, listen, I'm noticing a trend. The future is documentation.
Yeah.
I mean, as boring as it is, I think that especially on the side of the market that you're spending your time on, like there's real value. Carlos mentioned this on our last podcast where he said, repossessing an airplane is one thing. I need the records, or otherwise it's not worth what you think it is.
Yes, as George here said to me yesterday, it's a paperwork exercise now.
Yes.
And the part is in there somewhere,
And AOG just made that so much worse because it highlighted the risk to people. Now they actually have to ask the question
But it also highlighted the value of having a good engineer. Because that was what, that good engineering and good record keeping, because that was what exposed it in the first place, So, we should be. And, that feeds into a whole discussion about, engineering shortages that we're facing. I think we've probably embraced that as an industry, how tough it's going to be to attract people to spend their time on a ramp. It's 100 odd degrees here in Charlotte from end of June, July, August. You've got guys working out, second busiest hub for American Airlines. You've got guys working out. It's not, the glamour from a lot of it is gone, and you're standing on a ramp working on aircraft, and that is, there's a lack of maybe collective responsibility to get enough people trained up, and people who are really good will have a big advantage going forward, I think.
So AI is going to take care of that. AI is going to.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
You hold up your phone, and it says, AOG part detected.
Right.
Just it'll highlight it in red. And, but I mean, so over the past, well, particularly in the US, but over the past really 5 years, the attention was on the pilot shortage.
Yeah.
Right. I've been looking at the pilot shortage for a lot longer than that, based on what I was doing at Bombardier. But that's it's very sharp and sudden, and you feel it right away. What people don't realize is the very long macro technician shortage that we have, and it's more traditional. But whether it be engineers, whether it be technicians, we're struggling. And it's not a U.S. only thing, like the pilot shortage was for a few years.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily getting better. And suddenly at a time when the need for them is increasing with the need for documentation, right? You feel that a lot more than, say, Garrick and I do on our side of the business, but just finding the talent that can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So like we haven't talked about we mentioned the ISTAT appraiser program. Yeah. So obviously I'm an appraiser since 2017, I think, and taking a more active role in the appraiser community since.
You need to clean them up, Dave.
Yeah.
Rough them up a little bit.
But we try to take more of an active role in with making people who are appraiser candidates. There's often maybe a lack of appreciation for how important the records are and where they are, and what's there, and how much of a part of your evaluation is a construct of the quality of your records. Yeah.
That's actually a really good business idea for you, Garrick. you should have your published values with documents and without documents.
Right.
And then you can sell the documents.
Then I can sell it. Yeah. There you go. Yeah, because it's worth so much more. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so all this talk of documentation makes me think of. Remember when blockchain was a thing?
Yeah.
I'm still
I mean,
convinced this is a solution.
Right. And how, like, so, and, you know, it's not, I haven't heard about it as much as we did a few years back, but like, from your side, how, like, is that gain any traction? Is digitization, like, how does that work into the documentation side of things?
Yeah, it's like it's increased trend towards digitalization rather than boxes and boxes of ATA chapters, you know.
Yeah.
But the guys have been looking at options there, particularly as we grow the lease pool, you know. So it is. You're right, Garrick. It did die off because now we're bringing documentation back to this conversation. But it did die off. You know, it was a but it's very much relevant and it's there. But,
the reason why it died off is because crypto died off. I mean, NFTs, which is effectively what you're talking about, is each record it gets an NFT. You know, this is the source of truth. But those became, you know, just incredibly unpopular. I still think AI has this cycle to go through. But if somebody were going to do it and look at it, right now would be the time to do it because it's pure value, right? Yeah. This is the way to do it. Zero trust, public ledger. Yeah.
Yeah. So because we've been looking at like tech record software about, you know, upgrading or expanding what we use, and the conversation is always about AI and, you know, using AI for character recognition, whatever. You're going to look for a piece of paper and let AI do it for you, you know. But I haven't asked about blockchain, but I'm sure it's there as well, you know.
Yeah. Well, because you would think that it's because it is such an important part of the value of a component, you know, like, you know, I would have thought that it would gain more traction by now, just because of that fact, to try to make things also easier. Because you're talking about how now you've got more layers of documentation or more things that you need to provide. Like, well, that was a way of doing it. And yet I think people kind of lost focus on how do we continue on that path and do more of it. And, you know, and I don't know if it's just because of the other things that have been going on, like wars or whatever else we've got going on, that, you know, tariffs or, but but I'm surprised that it's not something that we readily talk about.
And like I think the you know, AI will add value on the record side for sure, but the commercial decisions that you're relying on records guys to make still needs to be made by them, and you know that's impossible to replace. Same, you know, legal pricing, and you know, repairs where we see AI, we see the benefit of it in those areas, but still having the experience to apply commercial acumen to it is something that we will always value above anything, you know.
So we still have some worth in ourselves, then, is what you're saying? Yeah, because we have experience.
You know, just take that away. Yeah. And even Courtney, you've kind of toned down. You had these graphs that you were using. Now, have you moved away from AI? Are you rejecting AI? Some of your forecasting.
So I use AI heavily, but only on the back end, right? So coding, early research, but you're not wrong. There is, I mean, I was just reading articles today, and it's big news. Like it's something to pay attention to. An executive at Google gave a commencement speech and was almost booed off the stage. There's this trend of graduates booing any mention of AI. So the backlash is here. I don't use it on anything on the front end of my business. That's all. Right.
Still you. Still
sorry.
That case.
Sorry. Haven't, but
sorry, not sorry.
The point being, like, when you're talking about records, actually, like, AI is not gonna, AI is great at filling in fuzzy gaps. Well, that's exactly what you don't want when you're dealing with records. But object character recognition, all that kind of stuff but it's been around forever. Like that's not anything new. But at the risk of sounding anachronistic, the blockchain, is, I am surprised, because there was talk even before the pandemic of that on the aircraft record side. Yeah. And I'm surprised we haven't seen more traction there.
Yeah, agreed. But there may be, we're just maybe more focused on AI, or no.
Just take note today, based on the podcast, when we publish it, somebody will then come out and be like, oh, you know what? Oh yeah, we forgot about that. Let's focus on that again.
Chicago. Yeah.
We'll see that.
Yeah. Like the incident, accident clearance statement there, just reminded me of, I think it was my first acquisition at Magellan was an A340 that had come out of Asia. It was a really, really old MSN. It had a tail strike. So it was one of the first usages, this is 2014, 2015, was our first time seeing the accidents clearance statement. And so normally you look at an aircraft and it's got an incident, it's a red flag, you don't proceed. But we looked into it, realized that the APU, the 4 engines, and the main legs, the landing gear, were not on the aircraft at the time of the. So
maybe that's why it had a tail strike.
Yeah.
Aha! You're onto something there, Courtney. Yeah,
sorry.
Not just a heart wreck. Yeah.
Sorry.
So they, but it was. So that was like, those kind of deals are rare, but they they can work out really well, and that was because we had the right people in the team to spot this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, look, and that's, as you said before, right? And then we could come back to it. Experience is just it's hard to replicate. Yeah. So and it's so valuable these days, and there is less and less of it. It seems, right? And we don't know what the younger generations, what experiences they will have that will be comparable to what, the old guys that seem like they're complaining a lot, they're like, it's like, what, I got to talk to this guy? Yeah, because he knows a lot. Oh, yeah, but he's going to yell at me for something. Those guys, that's those guys that just are, hardcore, right? They're retiring, right? They're going away, right? And they're taking the experience with them, which is a shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So. But look, Dave, it's been great chatting.
Yeah.
We've definitely taken up a lot of your time today. So
it was great. It was brilliant.
But it's always fun to chat with you, and glad we were able to bring you on, kind of share some of your background as well, and hear about what's going on. So glad that certainly very well deserved the promotion to president CEO, right? So looking forward to seeing how how well you do in that role, and. Keep us little people in mind, when you make it big.
A lot of people behind it, and my wife and daughter at home, I've been in Dublin, kind of, that's why I'm getting on 27-year-old 777s, So a bit of back and forth, but no, it's been worth it, and it's been great, and it's just hope we're geared up for the challenges that are ahead, and that some of the conversations we've had here turn out to be true, and that is it's a great industry. It really is.
It is. It's so much fun.
Yeah, and this end of it, like I talked earlier on about my career and how I bounced around between different companies, but this is where I've always kind of had a speciality.
That's where you're meant to be. Yeah. So, nice.
Yeah. Look, so we'll just take 30% transaction fee on every Magellan token that's issued. Crypto Magellan token.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bob's your uncle.
Yeah, there you go.
Is yen okay?
We'll take whatever you want.
Yen.
Whatever you can get rid of, that's fine. We'll take whatever. Yeah, that's right. We're a nonprofit, so we'll take whatever.
No, we are not a nonprofit. We are an unprofit.
Yes, that's true. We're unprofit. That's right. Yeah, we don't make any money off of this. So. No, but it's awesome. Certainly it's always a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah,
So
thanks very
I'm
much.
looking
and,
forward to the next time we can do it.
Okay, now say something stupid.